Welcome everyone to the Greener Hub webinar series. My name is Evelyn Zuniga and I'm one of the communications officers for the Greener Hub project. If you are new in the webinar series, I want to tell you that the Greener Hub project officially started in September 2022 as a coordination and support action of the European Commission under the Horizon Europe program, and it currently represents 15 ERA-NETs, co-funds, and self-sustained initiatives in the field of agri-food and biotechnology. We started these breakfast clubs last year in October, and the first topic of our series was circularity in agriculture. And the second in this year was related to biotechnology to advance sustainable solutions for bioeconomy. So if you're interested in topic related to mixed farming systems, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable farming, production of bioplastics, production of green chemicals, protein engineering, among others, all of our recordings are already in YouTube. And now for these 4 months, we're going to focus on the topic of sustainable food systems, where we're going to have our first talk today. We will be hearing about saline agriculture, food resilience and climate change, food trade, alternative and novel food systems, among many other topics. Just a few housekeeping announcements. So if you want to put your questions, you can use the Q&A and the chat box that I have activated for everyone. And I'm going to do my best to address as many questions as I can with the time that we have, which is 1 hour. Okay, so today we're going to have two panelists, Dr. Katarzyna Negacz and Professor Julian May. And we're going to open our round of presentation with Dr. Negacz. Give me 1 second because I need to share my screen again. Dr. Negacz is assistant professor at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. Her research focuses on non-state and subnational actors in global biodiversity governance and the potential of selling degraded lands for sustainable food production. Her background is in environmental and resource management, international economics, and law. For more than 12 years, she's been involved in research and practice related to sustainable development. Besides coordinating the SALAD project, she's currently working on international biodiversity governance project BioStar that focuses on national cooperative initiatives with relevance for biodiversity. Today, her talk is entitled Saline Agriculture as a Strategy to Adopt Climate Change, which is part of the SALAD project from the FOSC ERA-NET initiative. Dr. Negacz, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to present your project. And I am going to stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing yours. Yes, thank you so much. I think I stopped sharing, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me try to share my screen as well. See if that works well. Okay, can you see it now in the presentation mode?
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Kate Negacz, and indeed, I represent the SALAD project. Except for that, I also coordinate 3 other projects on salinity, and I also serve as the vice chair of the International Network of Salt-Affected Soils by FAO. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive introduction. You already know a lot about me, but let's now talk a little bit about saline agriculture and salinity. So we know that by 2050, 50% of total arable land worldwide will be affected by salinity. But it's actually already happening now and already in Europe. You can see on this image the bottom of the River Po. River Po is located in Italy, and last summer it was dry in many places, affecting agriculture, fishermen, transportation, and livelihoods of people who live in the valley of this river. So we know that the problems are happening worldwide, and we also can see that more and more international press is getting interested in this topic. Here you can see a few articles on the World Bank side talking about the problem in Bangladesh, in France, when the wine growers are struggling with salinity, in the Netherlands, when farmers are preparing for more saltier future, and also the European Parliament that recently conducted a few interviews with us to talk about the solutions for salinity. But what is salinity as such? So we are talking about the process when the soil is becoming more salty, the salt concentration in the soil is becoming higher, and it has a negative effect on plants, which then grow less well, and basically the yields, the agricultural yields, become reduced. So this is the process that is happening around the world, and we know now that around 17 million square kilometers are affected. Here you can see a map with all the affected areas, and we know that salinity causes quite a bit of economic losses, and these are the yields, but also other costs, for example, related to irrigation, to the losses not only in agriculture, but also other sectors, mitigation and adaptation costs. So it's a big problem. At the same time, we know that we can use management techniques that include crop, soil, and water solutions that are commonly known as saline agriculture that can help us to deal with this problem. And in many places around the world, we can apply these techniques to deal with salinity and to improve livelihoods of people who are affected by that. Now, I would like to talk a little bit more about the process and its consequences. So how comes that the soil becomes saline? In the North Sea and Mediterranean region, which our SALT project is dealing with, we have four main processes that actually cause salinization. The first one is irrigation with saline water. So basically, we put additional salt in the soil. The second one is aerosol, and this is usually what happens when you have the sea nearby, and basically there's saline spray coming over the land. Then you have flood salinization, and this is relatively rare, but every now and then the dikes are being broken, and the sea is basically flooding certain areas. That happened, for example, in the UK, but also in the Netherlands at some point of time. And then you have, of course, the soil affected by salinity again. And finally, the sea seepage, and this is relatively common. In the Netherlands, we actually have it almost every summer now, every dry summer. So the salty water from the sea is getting under the dunes and through the sand, wandering inland. So we know that all these processes, they will become more and more common due to the climate change, because you can see that the extreme weather events like droughts or floodings are just becoming more common. We also know that we have various saline environments, and that means not only agricultural lands, but also very biodiverse ecosystems, for example, the mangroves. Then, with saline agriculture, I've mentioned soil, water, and crop practices, and an interesting point are the salt-tolerant plants. In our project, we focus on four of them: quinoa, potato, tomato, and New Zealand spinach, but there are many, many more. And some plants, they even really like salinity, and they are so-called salt-loving plants, halophytes. And with these, we can actually work quite a lot on the heavily saline soils. Then we see that national governments are taking some action, but in many countries, this is not enough. And this is why we're also looking at the collaborative initiatives that deal with the problem. Stakeholders along the value chain are also taking actions, and they are getting more and more involved in these initiatives. And finally, we see that the investors and policymakers are also picking up the topic, investing more in saline agriculture, and also putting it on the policy agenda. And that brings me to the first example that I would like to present, which is saline governance landscape. So if you scan the QR code that you have here, you can see one of the outcomes of the SALAD project, which is the map of saline agriculture initiatives in Europe and Africa. And when you click on one of the dots, again, what you can see here on the picture, and as an example, you can see what these initiatives actually do. So in short, we see that more and more initiatives are hybrid, basically featuring public actors and also research actors. They mostly focus on operational activities such as trainings, trials, and information sharing. So they are basically networking platforms. The main themes that they focus on are conventional crops and water management, which is also interesting. Out of all the different themes that they can pick, they believe that water and plant interactions are most important. We, however, see that most often they are also short-time oriented. So on average, an initiative or a project, it lasts only around 3 years. So if you think about topics related to soil, plant growth, 3 years is really not that long, especially if you have agroforestry involved. Imagine having the trees and then seeing the effects of your treatment within 3 years, it's actually quite tricky. Then we look also at accountability mechanisms, so how they report what they do, how they monitor their progress, and we see that this can really be improved, also with the consequences of upscaling. So if we want saline agriculture to be effective, and if we want these initiatives to work, perhaps more effective approach would be also something that they can use. Then a quick overview of the impacts of salinity, which I've already mentioned. So we know that there is a declining water quality because the groundwater is becoming more saline. We know that it has impacts on climate change adaptation. Some traditional techniques are being altered. We see land and abandonment and also land use change due to the lower yields. So it happens that people need to migrate or they choose to migrate because of the salinity. And we also see loss of biodiversity. This is an interesting topic because with increasing salinity, the ecosystems are changing towards those more adapted to salinity, where we usually have less diversity but more specialized plants. Here, another example of our work, and this is actually work related to sub-Saharan Africa, where we mapped how severe are the salinity issues, how much knowledge is available, and also which policies are in place. So here we can see whether things are matching and not. And in principle, for the coastal areas, we usually deal with a severe salinity, and we have relatively good knowledge and good policy setup. So, for example, in Ethiopia or in Kenya, we can see that people know already how to live with salinity. At the same time, we see that the landlocked countries, they still require quite some research because we sometimes, for example, in Niger, don't know what is the extent of salinity, and also policy approach can be quite improved, for example, in Chad or in Sudan. And that brings us to our project, so SALAD, Saline Agriculture for Adaptation. In that one, we focused on 6 countries lying in the North Sea region and also in the Mediterranean region, but we collaborated with quite a few partners from other regions as well. So we decided to be transcontinental because we see that there are a lot of interlinkages as it comes to food systems and agriculture between these 2 regions. We believe that it's also innovative because it really focuses on upscaling of the saline agriculture, and I will talk about this more very quickly. We link the food systems and the climate because we see that this nexus topic is actually really important for saline agriculture. And we try to bring together the stakeholders from both research and practice to have it like really practice oriented, but also to generate some significant results as it comes to science. So here's a field in Egypt, which is salt affected, and you can see some tomato plants growing there. It's very close to the seaside. You can actually see dunes on the horizon. So it's an example where you can still grow crops on salt affected soils quite well. And here is a picture, a photo of a tomato growing there. As you can see, it's doing quite well. It's actually a good tomato. So the farmers there, they were actually quite happy with our interventions and increasing their yields. And that leads us to the scaling up aspect, which we focus on. So not only spreading across the countries and different regions. So here, 6 countries and more, and 4 crops, tomatoes, potato, quinoa, and New Zealand spinach, but also looking into new business models. So perhaps not only farming, not only agriculture, but maybe also tourism, maybe other sectors that can also benefit from the saline solutions. And vertical upscaling, so going from the farmers to the policymakers to create enabling conditions, for example, subsidies, or maybe some tax exemptions, and impact investors as well, because we still need microfinancing and we need bigger financing from international institutions. And that brings me to my last slide and 2 questions that I also have a bit for the audience that perhaps remain unanswered. So how can we actually build more inclusive, bigger multi-stakeholder community around saline science and practice? We have currently some big networks, for example, Water Scarcity in Agriculture Group in FAO or the International Network of Salt Affected Soils. Shall we build on the current networks or shall we develop something new? And also how we can mobilize more funds. What is the better strategy? Perhaps approaching the big financing organizations such as the World Bank, but maybe focusing on actually microfinance that can give small loans to the farmers that are in need. I also wanted to finish with a sentence that our salad project is actually coming soon to an end. But from salad, there was a new project starting, which is called Sustain, which is a cost action network, European platform, again, to share the results and also to, well, create a communication network platform. So if you are interested, it's open for everyone to join, and we very much welcome the new members. Thank you for your presentation. And if you have any questions, please do let me know.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Negacz, for your presentation. It was very there are many tools that people can actually kind of go and do the QR code. I saw that map before and I thought it was very, very useful for people who are actually studying saline soils. I just want to remind people that you can use the Q&A box and the chat box to put your questions. Feel free to put your questions, but in the meantime, I would like to ask, what was the criteria to select the 4 crops that you select for your the tomato, quinoa?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question, of course. And indeed, we looked into a few different lines. First, we look at why, let's say, which crops have a big potential in the countries that we are looking into. So for the Netherlands, the potato is actually an important staple in the food, in the diet. For Egypt, where we had the trials with tomato, that was one of the crops selected because it also plays important role in the national cuisine. Finally, quinoa, it's a new crop for Morocco, where people are looking quite a lot into couscous, but quinoa is similar, so it's easy to swap these two ingredients in a lot of recipes. So that was one of the paths that we were looking at. The second one, of course, was salt tolerance. So we also wanted to offer people crops that can adapt to salinity well, and that are interesting, promising from the research perspective. So these were perhaps the most important reasons for choosing those crops.
Okay, and so you're studying different varieties? Let's say on tomato, you're testing different varieties to see which ones are more tolerant and all that. So
yeah, indeed. For each of this, well, actually for 3 of these crops, so for quinoa, potato, and tomato, we have different varieties. For New Zealand spinach, it's different because that one is a halophyte, salt-loving plant.
Okay.
And there are not so many varieties. So there, I think it's just one variety, but it's quite specific because it's also not so common. So here we are testing okay, how you can actually introduce a new crop, a new plant into the diets, into actually a well-established culinary heritage in Italy, how people will react in the market. Are they willing to, experiment with that, or will they rather stick to something they know and appreciate since years?
Okay, I guess if you can just find a way to grow it in a saline, so you think twice. Okay, I think I can use this new crop now for my cuisine. So we have one question here, and it says, how much areas were affected in Ethiopia by salinity? Somebody's asking.
Okay, how much areas are affected in Ethiopia? That's a good one. I have to refer you to the report that we have just published a few days ago to check exactly how big is the surface area of the Ethiopia affected. However, if I remember correctly, that country is quite severely affected. I believe that there's around 30% of the country that to some extent is dealing with salinity. And there were also multiple initiatives and projects present there. So let me also share the link later in the chat so that you can see the report, which has detailed numbers.
Okay, perfect. And somebody else is asking, in your experience, are the regions aware of the problem? How can they assess if they are being affected by salinity? That's a good question, yeah.
Yeah, so that depends. Some regions, if we look at the global coverage, are very aware of the problem. For example, a month ago, I was in Uzbekistan, and there are more than 50% of the country is affected by salinity. They are very aware of the problem because it's their daily life and they have to deal with it. Similarly, in Egypt, also people just have to, eat, in fact, salt-tolerant crops on a daily basis because there is no alternative. However, in some countries, we know that they struggle with the problems, for example, in Chad or Mali. But sometimes there are different stresses, different types of soil degradation occurring. So we know that there is a drought, there are extreme temperatures, and probably salinity, but more research is needed because they are just vast areas which were not measured. And we may suspect that they are also saline, but we don't know to what extent. So whether it's, let's say, moderate salinity or strong salinity, and depending on that, there are different consequences both for people and for the management of these soils. So indeed, sometimes we're not fully aware because it just has not been measured, but very often, if there is a problem in the country, the people know and they also look actively for solutions.
Okay, yeah. So it says another one. It's forward osmosis, a viable technology to remedy saline waters, for example, groundwater and use of the cleaned water in agriculture.
Yeah, to be honest, I think this is a very interesting question, but since it refers to the technology, I would also refer you to my colleagues that work specifically with that, and they can also then give you the precise answer. My colleagues from the Salad project. I know that a lot of saline management techniques, they very much depend on the conditions. So in some circumstances, it may be a viable technology, something that is really worth looking into. But in the others, it may be not that well fitted. So it depends on the indeed type of salinity that you're dealing with, also the country. For some countries, it's easily available and let's say also within the economic range. And for some, it may be a bit tricky to use that technology.
Okay. I was wondering if like it's any of your or if your partners may be studying like how the microbiota changes in the soil and if there's like an indicator that you go like, okay, this organism, we have like a low count of this organism and that means that it's starting to get saline or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So indeed, we had partners in our first work package looking into what happens underground with the roots, with the root systems, how the roots behave, and also how the microorganisms are dealing with salinity. So I can refer to our Belgian partners, our Italian partners looking into that. Additionally, we have another spin-off project looking into soil biodiversity and how it changes with saline intrusion, and then with salty soils, let's say, becoming less salty. So how different changes affect the soil organisms, and also how the level of biodiversity changes, with the time. And they have some interesting results. So I believe that now they are working on a paper to publish and also to share the results with everyone.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I was also wondering, are there any, so you can grow like you test crops for high salinity and they grow there. Are there any species that remove salt and can act like to remediate the soil and kind of heal it somehow and then yeah.
Yeah, indeed, the phytoremediation, so the process of removing salt from soil, it's a bit of a holy grail. So everybody is looking into it, and
Mm,
people look at it with a great hope. However, for salinity, we need to look at it with a bit of caution. This is because, of course, some species would do it quite well, for example, trees, but then it takes a long time. And for some other species, for example, Salicornia, it also works, but Salicornia is a small it's a small plant. It's, let's say, size of your hand, maybe a bit more. It's a bit bushy, but it just takes a lot of time and also a lot of removal of salicornia that you need to also later process. So then you need to think, okay, it removes the salt from the soil, but what do we actually do with that plant? It can be fed to some animals. It can be also used for the human consumption. But yeah, if we have a lot of it, it's good to think, how are we going to use that plant, very saline plant, later on?
yeah, that's true. Yeah. We have a question here. It says, have you looked at biochar to reduce the salinity in soils?
Yes, this is a very promising management technique. So indeed, using biochar is currently a very popular management technique. And we also had some good results with that. So yeah, that's a very nice one.
Okay. And so the crops that you grow, the ones that you're testing, I'm just curious, like, does the taste of the things that you grow, the tomatoes, the potatoes, it changes? Like I read that the tomatoes get more sweet.
Yeah, that's correct. So indeed, the taste changes, and it basically changes in two directions. For the conventional crops, so potato, tomato, beetroot, they will become more sweet, and indeed you can very often feel that and have a richer taste in the sweet direction. And for the other crops or the other plants, the halophytes, you can see that it goes into the other direction, so they become more salty. So you can use them instead of salt. For example, if you have them dried, you can sprinkle them on the dishes or use as a spice or conditioning.
That's amazing. Like, yeah, like I imagine it's way healthier than just use salt and then your other spice. You have like all in one. That's nice.
Yeah, it actually is more healthier because a lot of salt-tolerant plants, they produce more antioxidants as their defense
Oh,
mechanism. So yeah, it's better than the conventional salt. I actually use
that's
it
great.
now. So yeah, it's a good solution.
Yeah, that's amazing. My last question will be, it's a bit like towards like kind of the management of your project. Like you're a young scientist, and I was curious on what has been your strategy to kind of coordinate like a transnational project, and how did you go about like to finding partners and all this kind of stuff? Because our webinars are for like young researchers, and I'm pretty sure that people are curious to see like how you're such a young scientist and like handling all of this.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I'm not young anymore, but good that I look young. That's very nice. Uh, well, my strategy and advice is the following. I've been working with other projects before, also related to salinity, and then I looked at the partners with whom I liked working and with whom I had actually positive experience. So these were the partners that we invited to join our consortium. And we also asked them for advice. Hey, do you know somebody good for, let's say, this work package, somebody that you have positive experience with? And they also invited partners that they trusted and that they have positive experience with.
Oh, okay.
And this is also what we did for 3 other projects that I'm now involved in. And well, some of them are also open to everyone to join, which I very much like, because then we can really extend our network and get, let's say, outside of snowballing, because it becomes a network. But of course, we are also want to be inclusive and stay open to other people.
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. We have more questions, but we don't have more time. So I think thank you so much, Dr. Negacz, for accepting our invitation to present your project. And now I'm going to move on to Professor Julian May. Thank you so much. Thanks. I'm just going to share my screen. Professor May, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to present your work. I'm just going to proceed to present a little bit of your experience. So, Professor May is Director of the Department of Science and Innovation, National Research Foundation, Center of Excellence in Food Security at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. And he is also, among other titles, a UNESCO Chair in the African Food Systems. He's an expert in applied poverty reduction assessment. His current research focuses on food security, childhood deprivation, and malnutrition. Professor May has worked on options for poverty reduction, including land reform, social grants, information technology, and urban agriculture in Africa and in the Indian Ocean islands. He has also worked in the development and use of systems for monitoring the impact of policy using official statistics, impact assessment, and action research. He has been a consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNESCO, FAO, among other institutions. Today, Professor May's talk is entitled Urban Food Resilience Under Climate Change Challenges, the case of a South African secondary city, which is part of the Urban FOSC project from the FOSC ERANET initiative. Professor May, I'm gonna share your slides as well. Perfect. It's everything in presentation mode, Professor May?
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I think, welcome to our presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about a project which is also, in fact, has VU as a partner, the same department, in fact, as the colleague who's just spoken. This is a project looking at urban food resilience under climate change, and we're looking specifically at a South African secondary city. The city is called Worcester, and by coincidence, I'm actually in Worcester today, and I'm sitting in the children's library using public Wi-Fi. I apologize, there is a little bit of noise because they are putting up some new bookshelves down the way.
Okay.
Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Urban FOSS, it takes place in 3 countries. We are doing work in collaboration with the University of Constantine in Algeria, Moi University in Kenya, and there our study site is Nakuru in the Rift Valley, and then in South Africa, the Worcester case study. So essentially, we're looking at 2 Mediterranean climate countries and 1 country which is in fact experiencing tropicalization. It's getting warmer and wetter. Each research team has a set of work packages that we've been going through since 2022, collecting data using household surveys, as well as satellite imagery and other kinds of research. Our European partners are Vrije University, Amsterdam, and CIRAD, the French Agricultural Research Center.
Professor May, do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so it was
And
just
you
like we lost you for a few seconds. You were in the
hopefully
main
that's the first
goal.
time. Now, hopefully that won't repeat itself. It hasn't happened all the way up until now. Okay, so key to the approach that we use is a notion of co-design. Here we work with the stakeholders, meaning the public sector, the policymakers, both at a municipal level, which is South Africa's lowest sphere of governance system, through to the provincial and national level. So that is very integral to the process that we try to follow. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, to start off, why are we concerned about doing research in South Africa? South Africa is unusual in that it presents what we've termed a food system paradox. It's the most industrialized country in Africa. It has one of the highest GDP per capita, or it has the highest GDP per capita in Africa. We produce a surplus of food and in fact are a major export to Europe. So we have a positive food balance. But at the same time, more than 20% of the South African population are moderately to severely food insecure. And of concern is more than a quarter of South Africans' children under 5 years of age are stunted, and this has not changed for 30 years. And that is despite having the same policies as Brazil and Peru, countries which have had seen a very positive trend in the reduction of child stunting. Finally, South Africa is also one of the most urbanized countries in the continent of Africa, with 67% of the population living in urban areas and a steady move from urban to rural. So food insecurity is particularly an urban problem in South Africa. Next slide, please. Now, as part of our innovation, we started, in fact, prior to the Urban FOSS project, to adopt what we've termed the place-based approach. This has been informed by research that's been done particularly in Europe and particularly in French-speaking countries in Europe, and it's often referred to as a territorial approach. By working on a place as a geographically defined place, we hope to crowd in research from different disciplines as one part of the process. The second is that we're able to build a good relationship with local stakeholders, which means our research can readily be transferred into policy findings. And finally, it provides us the opportunity to model a particular town and apply it to other circumstances, other towns that are similar. So the town of Worcester is similar to about 45 other secondary cities in South Africa, but it also has great similarities with Nakuru in Kenya and with Constantine in Algeria, so with our comparator sites. Finally, an important advantage, it allows us to embed researchers in the communities in which they're working. So we have had PhD students working in the local authorities where we are studying. Next slide, please. One of the things that we've observed from previous work is that local authorities can respond to climate change, but are often not aware that this falls within their mandate. So when talking to the municipal managers, frequently they say, this is not our mandate. It is an issue for the national government. It's an issue for departments of environmental affairs. But in fact, here I've provided you with a list of the things that a local authority can do, which would respond to climate change. It includes how the taxes that they're able to levy, the way in which the incentives that they are able to provide to attract businesses to the area, the zoning regulations, the grants that they can apply for from national government, And in particular, as we saw with COVID, local authorities bear the brunt of any early responses to disasters, whether these are local or national. What we experienced in South Africa is that local authorities frequently were the first to have to deliver food packages or provide support in other ways to people. And in particular, they were the authority responsible for regulations concerning the use of space, including social distancing. Next slide, please. The Vrije Valley municipality, where I'm seated, you can see it in the yellow mark on the map, has a, and I've also tried to depict what we might consider as the Vrije Valley's food line. In other words, an area approximately 160 kilometers from which most of the food of the Vrije Valley could in fact be drawn. It's one of 237 municipalities in South Africa. It comprises 4 formal towns, 16 informal settlements, and 450 commercial farms. Agriculture is the most important sector, employing around 24,000 workers, about 3% of South Africa's workforce, and 13% of the Western Cape. If you are in Europe and you've eaten grapes from South Africa, the odds are that these grapes were produced in the Vrije Valley. It's a significant producer of grapes. In addition, increasingly, we are exporting butternuts to Europe. So again, if you had a butternut this week, odds are it came from the Vrije Valley. Producers are adapting to the climate change which they are experiencing. It consists of floods, unseasonal weather patterns, season shift, heat waves, and high winds. And they've adopted a range of technologies to be able to do that. But communities, and particularly poor communities, remain at risk of all of these disasters. Next slide, please. As I've already mentioned, the Vrije Valley spans both the Mediterranean climate, but some parts of it are also
Okay, think again. Maybe give him a few seconds to rejoin. Professor May, do you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
I'm back again.
Yeah, so this is you're at the beginning of these slides. Perfect.
I will try and speed up so I can make up the time lost in the drop process. Okay, you'll see some of the major challenges faced by the Vrije Valley. In fact, it includes the salinity of the soil that you've also just heard discussed. And this is largely due to the use of groundwater, which is saline already, and how that is then applied to the soils, which are not well adapted to this. Next slide, please. So what we've been trying to do in particular in Urban FOSC is to try and use opportunities to model how land is used, model how policies are developed, and how that can then impact upon the food system. So this is not an agricultural project, it is a food system project.
Mm-hmm.
To do that, we made use of Bayesian network modeling as a way of being able to illustrate the complex systems that are present in any food system. So this work is largely being done by our colleagues at Vrije University, making use of a data set that we gathered from households, the 1,000 household sample survey, and there's data from the municipality who provided administrative information, as well as other satellite imagery. Next, please. The network analysis that we have done is depicted here, and you can see the different components of information that we were able to bring to bear in our Bayesian analysis. We looked at 3 outcome variables, which we had from the survey, a food and security index, and a measure of diet choice by households, and finally the dietary diversity of households. I'll be focusing on this last one. But
Yeah, we're back again, Professor May.
Yeah,
okay.
Back again.
So you're in the last of the 3 pillars that you were talking about.
Yes. Let's wait for the slide to start up.
Next slide, sorry.
I'll just wait for the slide to start up.
Okay.
I can't see the slide as yet.
Ah, okay.
Still not seeing the slide. There you go. Okay, so I will be focusing on the Dietary Diversity Index, but we have information on the other two as well. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so using these data, we are able to map, we are able to produce a series of maps and illustrations of the city of Worcester. The top left firstly just draws an important thing, which always has to be borne in mind when doing research in South Africa. South African cities remain structured by race and by class. So in the case of Worcester, essentially, probably like many other parts of Africa, the rich people, who are mostly white, live in the higher parts of the town, away from the climate change hazards, and the poor people, mostly black, live in the areas but close to the river. And you'll see that in the map on the top left. Using the data that we have, we can then also map things like where do people mostly obtain their food. So the graph on the right shows where people are mostly obtaining their food from informal vendors, from street traders. And again, there you'll see, in the case of the wealthy people, they mostly purchase their food from supermarkets. And in the case of the poor people, they mostly purchase from informal producers. This actually was extremely useful information for the city of Worcester when we were doing this work during the period of COVID, because at that point, the South African government had decided to prevent informal traders from operating at all. What you essentially did then was produce hunger in the most poor parts of the Worcester area. The graph down the side at the bottom then starts to show how we can then link food insecurity into our map and identify which parts of Worcester are the most food insecure. So that's one illustration of the kind of work that we've been doing. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here it gets interesting. What we've attempted to do is identify feasible interventions that could be adopted by a local authority in South Africa. So, for example, a local authority is able to support street vendor infrastructure. They can provide trading zones, they can provide water facilities to keep items cool. And so that is a policy option which we then have tried to model. A local authority can also provide nutrition education program. And in fact, what you see behind me are the books at the local library about the food system. This is a coincidence. I wasn't aware that they even were doing this while we've been doing this research. Other interventions that a local authority can do is to extend the public transportation networks, increase access to school feeding, and also intervening to try and promote the prices of healthy food items, again, through providing incentives to vendors. What we've done here is map the extent to which those interventions might increase the dietary diversity of households living in different parts of Worcester. So you can see there that supporting street vendor infrastructure is in fact not going to assist people in the poorest part of Worcester, timber. Largely because it's not necessary. The street traders are able to operate in the roads. They are not actually the regulations that apply to the center of Worcester are not applied in the case of the settlement. Whereas in the center of Worcester and in some of the wealthier parts, if street traders were to be able to operate in those areas, people would have a more diverse diet. And this is because street traders in this part of the country provide foods which are bought from the surrounding fertile and rich farming areas. And you can see again how we try to map across the different kinds of interventions to show how this would impact upon dietary diversity. With blue, meaning we would increase dietary diversity, and red meaning it would have no impact or in fact possibly reduce dietary diversity. We can go to the next slide. Now, policy obviously doesn't work in isolation. It is unlikely that a municipality would opt for a single policy, and rather they would opt for combinations, for bundles of policies. So again, what we've tried to do here is map which are the options which that might be bundled together. To do this, we actually brought the research that you've just seen to Worcester, and a month ago held a workshop with local stakeholders, and that included the municipality, people from the local traders association, other people involved in the food system, and piloted which were the most likely options that this municipality might like to be able to adopt. And we came up with these kinds of options. So firstly, to provide a combination of promoting street vendor infrastructure and providing opportunities to add local value, to valorize the items that are sold. We could add policies that reduce the consumption of healthy food. And finally, we could encourage local supermarkets to discount healthier foods and not to discount unhealthy foods. And you can see the impact is greatest if you have that combination of policies, all of which are feasible for a local authority. Next slide, please. Again, here's another set where we again try to provide different policy options and show how these would impact upon the dietary diversity of areas in Worcester. Key here is that the municipality can then start to identify which areas they are working in and where they are which policy bundle might work best in that particular community. Next slide, please. So coincidentally today in the room next door, and this is why I needed to do this webinar from the Worcester Public Library, we're providing training in data in feminist methodologies to collect data. This is to a group of community workers who are involved in projects in Worcester, which are trying to, in fact, do some of the interventions that we've undertaken. We had noticed from our research that frequently women are bearing the excessive cost of an inefficient food system, but also bearing the cost of when municipalities or other authorities attempt to make interventions. There's an unintended consequence, and that unintended consequence is borne by women. So that is why we decided to provide training in Worcester. Again, this is part of the urban FOSC approach. Mm-hmm. You can see the kinds of things that we've done. We've adopted what are called learning journeys, and I can talk more about that. We've adopted policy labs, and again, I can talk more about that. And we've involved a number of new partners, including CoE-FS in Belgium, who've been doing some urban design projects in Worcester to be able to propose options for the municipality. So I'll end with what my colleagues in design talk about as a design provocation. We have an image of what Worcester looks like today and an image of what Worcester could look like if we were to think, instead of putting gardens in the city, what if we were to think about saying the city is in a foodscape? The city itself needs to be in a garden. And that is an idea which we're going to take forward with the Worcester municipality. Thank you. You can end the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor May, for a fantastic presentation. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. And I want to remind people that they can use the chat box and the Q&A box to put your questions. Okay, so I do have a question. So what impact do you foresee with this kind of research on urban planning? Like how this will impact the planning of new, let's say, new neighborhoods, new cities?
Let me give you one example, which I think we have identified as an opportunity and which at the moment the municipality thinks is a problem. So this area has experienced considerable in-migration from other parts of South Africa. And principally, people that have moved here are used to livelihoods that involve the raising of small livestock, of goats, of sheep, and so forth. The municipality has tended to see this as a problem, an issue of how do they control or limit it. What we are finding, though, from the research that we've been doing in our comparator country in Algeria, in fact, agropastoralism can be a way of managing climate change risks. The livestock that the municipality are concerned about could, in fact, be an ally by keeping down vegetation growth during our wet winter months, which then burns in our hot, dry summer. So we are now proposing to the municipality and providing them with comparative evidence from other countries that this, in fact, could be a policy opportunity. They've recognized it, and they've set up a task team that are now working with the small livestock growers to try and find a way in which we can accommodate both their needs, but also the needs of the city to be able to regulate and be concerned about the health issues around public health. So that's a concrete example.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually, my other question was about like any successful initiatives or programs that have effectively like tackled food insecurity in urban and peri-urban settings. So yeah, you just mentioned that example. So in your opinion, what are the most like pressing research needs or priorities that we need to address when it comes to food insecurity in urban and like peri-urban areas in South Africa. Where do you think the research focus should kind of go to?
When I think there's a range of issues that we need to be concerned about, and I think these are issues that would be relevant to other countries like South Africa that are in the global south but are middle-income countries. So key, what we're seeing in South Africa is the coexistence of child stunting and adult obesity and overweight. So we see a double, often talked about as a triple burden of malnutrition in South Africa. And this is when obesity is actually a product of poverty rather than a product of people having too much money. People are buying energy dense but nutrient deficient foods because these are the cheapest.
Yeah.
So that is one of the reasons why we have this interest in trying to encourage dietary diversity and finding policies that would move us out of that circumstance.
Yes, I see. So you mentioned in one of your slides about the learning journeys that you said you could mention more in depth about that. Can you just give us more insight on that?
Sure. So this is an idea that we've adapted from participatory action research, which was a notion that was developed in the mid-80s and I think continues to happen. But a learning journey then actually tries to recognize that learning needs to take place in two directions. It's not that the researchers have knowledge which they bring to communities. Researchers also need to learn. So we see it as a very firmly grounded in a constructivist paradigm of knowledge production. The way we've operated these learning journeys, they essentially are a curated event where we identify people in a community who are going to host a group that we will bring to them. And the group will comprise researchers, local authority, members of the local authority, sometimes political councillors, members from other branches of government who can make a contribution towards development in these areas. We then engage with the people who would host us. That could be a street trader, for example, who's selling apples and tomatoes in the street, who would explain to us what it means for them, how they bring the food to sell, how they set their prices, who their customers are, and ultimately what do they do to the food that is wasted? How do they dispose of food that is potentially could be fed into a circular economy? So that is the nature of the event. What we have noticed, we then followed with essentially what has been also talked about in the literature as a policy lab, where we then engage with those decision makers to see what are the possible options for interventions that could be made. We've seen some positive results. We are also concerned, as our colleagues may be aware, when you put decision makers and confront them with information, there's a risk that they start making promises that they cannot keep. And we've seen that as well. And that is a concern for us as researchers.
Yeah, definitely. And what about the policy lab workshops? What are they about?
So those were attended then, and I'll give you an example of the most recent one. We were able to have quite senior people, in fact, very senior people from our provincial Department of Agriculture. So agriculture in South Africa is a subnational mandate. So the provinces or states are responsible for the implementation of agricultural policies. We also had people from the National Planning Commission who attended. So this is the body that guides South Africa's long-term national plan, as well as the municipal authorities. Key to that was the participation also of people from the private sector. So in our study area, there is a significant producer of broiler chickens who also provide, through their social development funding, support to local NGOs who provide feeding programs in early childhood development centers, essentially kindergartens. So this was a way of bringing these diverse groups together to see what were the barriers, what were things that could be done to improve the food system in the Worcester. An example of what came out of that, there are many of these kindergartens are in fact informal. They're not registered, and they do not receive state support. Oh. The reason for that is a zoning decision, and they need to apply for a permit to occupy a piece of land from the municipality. Mm-hmm. The municipality had not been giving that permit because they regarded these as informal, and now realize that this is a way in which they can, with simply changing a regulation, simply by giving a and receive.
Dr. May, do you hear me?
I can hear you. You froze
Now,
for a
yes.
moment, but I can hear you.
Yeah, no, you're back. Yeah, it was just like few seconds. So when you go with these cases to, again, with the results of your research to the local authorities, what is kind of the main problems that they see, like, and how to, like, they said, like, okay, this is hard to implement because, or like the main reasons they give?
That's a very good question, because I mean, I think as a group of researchers and this group, I think, is very, we are encouraged by our funders to be able to achieve impact with our research.
Yeah.
And I think we often don't understand how to do that. And particularly people who maybe have not been trained in the social sciences would come with an idea which sounds like technically a great idea, but then for some reason you don't get heard. One of the things that we learned from our long-term interaction with the local authority is that there is a planning cycle, a policy cycle, and we need to fit our work around that cycle. So in the case of South Africa, every 5 years, a local authority needs to prepare what they call an integrated development plan. Essentially, this is a 5-year guideline of how they're going to spend their money. Every year they update that. And we need to plug into either the 5-year cycles when they entirely develop a new plan, or plug into when they are updating it. If you can do that, if you can get your timing right, you can be talking to someone who's actually at that moment preparing a budget of how they're going to spend their money. That becomes key. And that's exactly what we were able to do with the livestock argument, the livestock example that I gave to you earlier. There was in the previous IDP in this area, there was no mention of climate change, food security, malnutrition, and definitely no mention of livestock. In the current integrated development plan, which has just been approved by their council, all of these items are covered. And in each case, they've set aside money to do something. And I think that's where we tend not to be aware of that cycle of decision-making that takes place by any level of government.
That is very interesting to hear, because like me, like as a researcher, yeah, you don't really think that you need to be in sync with all of this kind of the world of policy making. Like you really have to kind of do your research if you really want to implement the results of your research. That's very interesting. Professor May, all I have to say is thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much for answering our question. Dr. Negacz, thank you very much for accepting our invitation as well. And the time of our webinar is over, so I would like to remind you, you can all register for the next webinar. It's already kind of, I'm going to start like doing the publicity for it. We will have Dr. Monica Mburu and from Dedan Kimathi University in Kenya talking about integrated chia and oyster mushroom system for sustainable food value chain in Africa, and Professor Göksen Kapar from Ankara University will be talking about cross-border climate impacts on food trade between Europe, Africa, and Turkey. So thank you very much to both of my panelists. I'm very grateful to have you here with me, and thank you everyone for your questions, and I'll see you in other opportunities.